MP.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Today's budget is the final act in a financial crisis which has seen debt move from the financial sector to the public purse and is now piled onto individuals who will be comprehensively unable to foot the bill for the Chancellor's raid on tax credits, on housing benefit for under 25s and on families with more than 2 children. And I will deal with this before honourable members leap to intervene. The living wage is not set at a level that would permit households to cope without in-work support. The Chancellor referenced the Resolution Foundation in his statement, but they have said that if in-work support is cut, then, and I quote, "as night follows day, the living wage will rise." Excluding in-work support raises the London living wage to £11.65, revealing the Chancellor's announcement as mere rhetoric and, as my honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition said, giving with one hand and taking with the other. This budget serves notice that we have a Chancellor steadfastly refusing to tackle fundamental issues in our economy which are causing rising levels of household debt. Indeed, it is ominous to listen to a Chancellor talk with such confidence today when significant underlying weaknesses in the economy, which have been causing serious concern for some time, are completely ignored. Yeah. The Chancellor may have wanted a rebalanced economy and a recovery built on rising incomes, but that is simply not happening. High debt, low pay, an economy based on credit and housing bubble, a deregulated financial sector, back to business as usual. What was wrong in 2007 remains wrong to this day. It is that we do not have a resilient financial system. In the recently published Financial System Resilience Index, the UK ranked lowest amongst all G7 countries. It is that household debt is rising to levels not seen before, higher even than at the peak of the crisis. Last year alone, it grew by 9%, an increase of £20 billion on householders' credit cards and other debts. And it is that the housing bubble continues apace, a market overheating. Exhortations from the Governor of the Bank of England ignored. He warned, and I quote, "What happens if households borrow at high multiples? They economise on everything in order to pay their mortgages. If enough people are highly indebted, it can have big macroeconomic impacts. There is therefore a possibility that current responsible lending standards become irresponsible to reckless." Yeah. Madam Deputy Speaker, these issues are all interlinked. We have shifted the debt of the financial sector onto the public balance sheet, and now in the final act of the financial crisis, the Chancellor is shifting it onto individuals, an economy built on the same old mistakes. Because I don't think anyone in this place would care to suggest any longer that we are beyond the days of boom and bust, and we are witnessing this in the international markets as we speak. Whilst the world is understandably focused on Greece, China's markets are in little short of meltdown. Crashes, unfortunately, are very far of a thing of the past, and I would suggest that in the UK, we are closer to the next one than we are to the last. Before I entered this place, I worked in the City of London, so I can report to the House that the culture, the risk-taking, the short-termism, and the excessive pay and bonuses remain as prevalent today as they were prior to the crash, although I should hasten to add that I myself was not privy to such excessive pay. I will happily give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way. And would she not agree by segregating retail banks for investment banks, then it is less likely that if the investment bank collapses that it will contaminate the commercial bank? I declare an interest in having worked on the unwind of the Lehman Brothers estate.
The investment arm from the high street banking arm is the right was one of the answers to the cause of the financial crash, but we've not had an update recently, and as I understand it, the banks aren't cooperating either with each other or with the regulators on this issue. It would be very helpful actually to have an update on this from the Minister. This financial sector, which heaped masses of debts onto ordinary people, onto our constituents, we do not want them to pay. We're not vengeful sorts in this House. We want them to reform so that it can never happen again. But instead of learning from the mistakes that I accept the last Labour government made, which would have enabled the government to build a sustainable economy in which everyone can share, the party on the benches opposite have imposed their ideological agenda onto a terrible financial crisis in order to shrink the state and entrench inequality. Hence why the UK's recovery was delayed by 3 years after America's and Germany's, squandering billions in lost output. But what matters now is what the government will do about it. And the problem is that the government aren't merely acting with intransigence, they are exacerbating the problems. The measures in today's budget on tax credits may take debt off the government books, but they heap it directly onto some of the most low-paid, the most vulnerable, and those who can just about afford their mortgage if they have one at all. £1,400 for a working parent who lives on their own. That's what the government have saved, but do they think that a lone parent can afford to lose £1,400 a year? He or she will take out credit cards to pay for their children's school trip, for the clothes, for the rent or for the mortgage, and household debt will rise and rise. Turning maintenance grants into student loans, passing debt straight off the government's books to those who can least afford it and who are the most adverse to debt. A generation of young people is being created not just accustomed to personal debt, but reliant on it. The Chancellor said today he wanted to move away from an economy based on debt, but he made no mention of records of household debt. Indeed, some of the OBR's forecasts were not mentioned by the Chancellor today. For example, the forecast that the ratio of total household debt to income will rise by 26% by 2020. And most of this is unsecured debt, which the OBR expects an additional £48 billion of which will be added by 2020 compared to the March outlook. Overall household debt is now expected to reach 167% of household income by 2020, and household disposable income will be down by 1.5% in 2020 compared to the estimate at the previous budget. Private debt turned into public debt, and now onto the backs of individuals, the same mistakes repeated again. If this were a budget genuinely designed to help working people, we would have seen measures to tackle the inherent issues in our economy. We would have seen genuine ambition on lifting wages, not mere rhetoric, action to lower housing costs, commitments to increase social housing, and measures to mitigate against the spiralling household debt. Instead, we have seen yet more tinkering around the edges, just like every budget before it for the last 5 years. Not only does this budget hurt working people, it stores up yet more problems for the future that it will take at least a generation to fix.
Oh, yeah.